You stopped explaining yourself a long time ago. At first you tried. You tried to tell people why certain conversations no longer satisfied you, why the things that once entertained you suddenly felt empty, why your heart seemed to be searching for something you could not even put into words. But every attempt ended the same way. Someone laughed. Someone told you that you were overthinking. Someone said you had changed too much. Eventually, silence became easier than explanation. You still sat in the same rooms, still smiled at familiar faces, still answered messages, but something inside you knew that the distance growing between you and everyone else could not be measured in miles. It was measured in understanding. The people around you seemed to remain comfortable where they were, while your soul felt restless, almost as if God had planted inside you a desire that refused to let you settle. That is what made the loneliness so confusing. You did not want to become distant. You did not wake up one morning deciding to outgrow the people you loved. In fact, you prayed for the opposite. You asked God to let things stay the way they had always been. You hoped the friendships would survive. You hoped your family would understand. You hoped that the people who once encouraged you would celebrate your growth instead of becoming uncomfortable because of it. Yet little by little, conversations became shorter. Invitations became fewer. People who once knew every detail about your life now seemed like strangers. Perhaps you even wondered if something was wrong with you. Maybe you questioned whether your expectations had become unrealistic. Maybe you blamed yourself for becoming difficult to understand. But what if the deepest reason for this painful season is not that you have become impossible to love, but that God has been quietly transforming your heart in ways that naturally change the direction of your relationships before they change the direction of your life? That possibility is difficult to accept because we usually believe growth should bring more acceptance, not more isolation. We expect becoming spiritually healthier to make everything easier. Instead, there are seasons when becoming more faithful makes you feel less understood than ever before. It almost feels backwards. The closer you draw toward God's presence, the more you notice that some conversations begin to feel shallow. The things that once consumed your attention lose their grip. The need to impress people slowly fades. Arguments that once seemed important suddenly appear meaningless. You begin protecting your peace instead of protecting your image. You begin seeking wisdom instead of applause. You become slower to react, quicker to forgive, more careful with your words, and strangely less interested in proving yourself. Not because you think you are better than anyone else, but because your heart has started longing for something deeper than approval. Yet that quiet transformation is often invisible to everyone around you. They only notice that you are different. They may even misunderstand your silence as pride. They may confuse your boundaries with rejection. They may assume you think you are superior simply because you no longer participate in everything you once did. Few people realize that what looks like confidence on the outside may actually be the result of countless nights spent crying before God, asking Him why everything feels so unfamiliar. Growth is rarely glamorous while you are living through it. Most of the time, it feels like grieving a version of yourself that can no longer return. It feels like carrying memories that still make you smile, while accepting that those moments belong to another season. It feels like thanking God for relationships that shaped you, while realizing they may not be able to carry you into the future He is preparing. If this speaks to your life, leave a comment saying, "I understand," not because those two words solve your loneliness, but because sometimes discovering that someone else has walked this road reminds you that you are not losing your mind. There are others who have sat awake wondering why they no longer fit into places that once felt like home. There are others who have questioned whether spiritual growth always has to feel so lonely. There are others who have whispered silent prayers, asking God to explain why obedience sometimes costs so much. One of the hardest truths to embrace is that every season of growth quietly exposes the difference between relationships built around comfort and relationships built around purpose. Comfort enjoys the version of you that never changes. Purpose encourages the version of you that God is still creating. That difference is not always obvious at first. Some people celebrate your progress as long as it remains small enough not to challenge their own decisions. They applaud your discipline until it reminds them of their compromises. They admire your peace until it exposes the chaos they have accepted. They encourage your faith until it begins changing your priorities in ways they no longer recognize. Suddenly, without anyone saying it directly, you begin feeling as though your growth has become inconvenient. That realization hurts because you genuinely love these people. You are not looking for reasons to leave them behind. You simply cannot pretend that God has not been changing you. Think about the seed buried beneath the soil. Before anyone celebrates the tree, the seed disappears into darkness. It splits apart. It loses the shape everyone recognized. If another seed could observe that process, it might think destruction had taken place. Yet heaven calls it growth. In much the same way, there are seasons when your life appears to be falling apart because the old version of you cannot survive the calling God is quietly developing. What people interpret as distance may actually be transformation. What feels like loss may actually be preparation. The painful part is that preparation often happens before the purpose becomes visible. That is why waiting becomes so exhausting. You can sense that something is changing inside you, but you cannot yet explain what God is preparing you for. You simply know you cannot return to who you used to be. You remember praying for greater faith, greater wisdom, greater peace, greater purpose. But perhaps you did not realize that every one of those prayers required becoming someone different. And becoming someone different almost always changes who feels comfortable walking beside you. Scripture repeatedly shows ordinary people entering unfamiliar seasons before stepping into greater purpose. They often experienced misunderstanding before they experienced fulfillment. They learned dependence before influence. They discovered that God's work inside the heart usually begins long before anyone else notices the evidence on the outside. That pattern has not changed. Even today, spiritual maturity often develops quietly, away from applause, away from recognition, away from crowds. Perhaps that is why this season feels so hidden. God may be doing his deepest work in places where only he can see it. Every disappointment has been teaching you endurance. Every unanswered question has been stretching your trust. Every lonely evening has been inviting you to discover that his presence can become more real than the approval you once chased. None of this removes the pain. Loneliness is still loneliness. Rejection still wounds the heart. Watching relationships slowly fade still brings tears that no one else notices. But pain and purpose are not always enemies. Sometimes purpose grows through pain instead of around it. Sometimes the very experiences that convince you that you are falling behind are the same experiences God uses to shape the character you will need for the future he alone can see. The greatest danger during seasons like this is believing that because people no longer understand you, God must have abandoned you too. Yet what if his silence is not absence, but patient craftsmanship? What if he is building strength that cannot be rushed? What if he is teaching you to find your identity in him before entrusting you with responsibilities that would crush the version of you used to be? Those questions do not erase every fear, but they invite a different perspective. Instead of asking why everyone seems to be drifting away, perhaps the deeper question becomes, what is God producing inside me through this season that could never have grown while everything remained comfortable? That question does not produce instant answers, but it opens the heart to hope. And hope changes how you carry your waiting. It reminds you that becoming different is not the same as becoming abandoned. It reminds you that outgrowing certain seasons does not mean you love people less. It simply means God continues calling you forward. Before this part of the journey ends, take a quiet moment and share in the comments what lesson this season has been teaching you. Your story may become the encouragement another weary heart desperately needs. And as difficult as this road has been, there is still a deeper truth waiting to unfold. One that reveals why some of the relationships you feared losing were never meant to define your identity, and why God sometimes allows your world to become smaller before he expands your purpose in ways you never imagined. There is a kind of grief that almost no one talks about because it does not come from death, betrayal, or dramatic endings. It comes from realizing that you can sit beside someone you have known for years and feel as though you no longer speak the same language. They are talking about the next distraction, the next purchase, the next argument, the next temporary excitement, while inside your heart another conversation is taking place. You are wondering why God has been stirring such deep questions within you. You are asking why success suddenly feels empty if it is disconnected from purpose. You are noticing needs that you once ignored. You are becoming sensitive to things that never bothered you before. The gap between your inner world and your outer relationships grows quietly until one day you recognize it without anyone having to say a word. You leave gatherings feeling strangely exhausted instead of refreshed. You replay conversations in your mind and realize how little of yourself you actually shared. You smile through moments that once would have made you laugh without thinking. Yet something inside you remains untouched. This is often the point where people begin accusing themselves. They wonder if they have become cold. They question whether they are becoming antisocial. They fear they are losing the ability to connect. Yet what if your soul is not losing its ability to connect at all? What if it is simply becoming more careful about what truly nourishes it? A child can spend hours playing with toys that an adult walks past without even noticing. That does not mean the adult is incapable of joy. It simply means maturity changes what satisfies the heart. In the same way, spiritual growth often changes what your soul can comfortably live on. Conversations that revolve around gossip no longer leave you fulfilled. Constant comparison becomes exhausting. Chasing approval begins to feel like carrying a weight you were never created to bear. You start craving honesty over popularity, depth over appearance, peace over excitement, truth over performance. None of those desires make you superior to anyone else. They simply reveal that God has been reshaping your appetite. One of the quiet miracles of spiritual maturity is that it changes your desires before it changes your circumstances. Long before your life looks different on the outside, your heart begins wanting different things. That inner transformation can feel confusing because your surroundings may remain exactly the same while your perspective has completely changed. You walk through familiar places with unfamiliar eyes. The habits that once seemed normal now feel heavy. The endless race to prove yourself begins to lose its appeal. You notice how much energy people spend protecting images instead of healing hearts. You begin praying more honestly because pretending before God no longer feels possible. Instead of asking Him to simply remove every difficulty, you slowly begin asking Him to make you faithful inside the difficulty. That is a prayer many people never learn to pray because it requires trusting that God values your character even more than your comfort. Looking back through Scripture, it becomes clear that the people God used most deeply were rarely the people who stayed emotionally comfortable. Their journeys often included seasons when they no longer fit naturally into the environments they once called home. Their hearts were being enlarged while their surroundings remained the same. That tension became one of the ways God prepared them. It taught them dependence instead of self-sufficiency. It taught them humility instead of pride. It taught them patience instead of control. Imagine trying to explain to someone that your greatest struggle is not the hardships around you, but the change happening within you. How do you describe the strange feeling of missing people who are still alive, simply because the relationship is no longer what it once was? How do you explain that you still love them deeply, yet your conversations rarely reach the places your heart now lives? This is one of the loneliest forms of growth because it carries no clear ending. There is no dramatic goodbye. There is only the quiet awareness that the journey has changed. Sometimes you keep praying that everything will return to normal, but God gently reminds you that He did not call you backward. He called you forward. Forward often sounds exciting until you realize it also means leaving behind familiar versions of yourself. There is another reason this season feels so painful. Human beings naturally associate belonging with safety. From the beginning of life, we long to know that we are accepted, welcomed, and understood. So when growth creates distance between us and people we love, our hearts interpret that distance as danger. We begin wondering whether we have made a mistake. We question every decision. We even wonder whether obedience has somehow led us away from happiness. Yet God often works precisely in those moments when every other source of security begins to loosen its grip. Not because He delights in taking things away, but because He knows that nothing built upon human approval can permanently sustain the soul. If your identity depends entirely upon people always understanding you, then every misunderstanding will shake your foundation. But when your identity becomes rooted in God's unchanging love, You slowly discover a different kind of stability. You still desire healthy relationships. You still grieve losses. You still feel disappointment. But those experiences no longer determine your worth because your value is no longer being negotiated by changing opinions. That freedom develops slowly. It is usually born through many prayers that seemed unanswered at first. There were nights when you asked God to fix everyone around you, only to discover that He was quietly strengthening something inside you instead. There were mornings when you wanted immediate clarity, but He gave you enough light for only the next step. There were seasons when you believed nothing was happening because everything looked the same on the surface, while beneath that surface, He was rebuilding your heart in ways that only eternity will fully reveal. Perhaps one of the hardest lessons is realizing that not every relationship is meant to carry every version of your life. Some people were gifts for a particular chapter. They encouraged you when you needed encouragement. They stood beside you when you were learning certain lessons. Their presence was never meaningless. Yet seasons change, and God sometimes writes new chapters that require different kinds of conversations, different responsibilities, different opportunities to serve, and different levels of spiritual maturity. Recognizing this does not require bitterness. In fact, maturity allows gratitude and grief to exist together. You can thank God for someone who helped shape your past while honestly acknowledging that your paths are no longer moving in the same direction. Gratitude keeps your heart soft. Resentment keeps it trapped. The enemy would love for your loneliness to become bitterness because bitterness convinces you that everyone is against you. But God invites you toward compassion instead. He reminds you that every person is walking their own journey, facing battles you cannot fully see. Some are growing quickly, some are growing slowly, some are standing still. Your responsibility is not to judge their pace, but to remain faithful to the work God is doing within you. That perspective protects your heart from pride. Spiritual growth is never an invitation to look down on others. It is an invitation to look more honestly at yourself. The closer you walk with God, the more aware you become of your own need for grace. You stop measuring your life against other people because you realize everyone is being shaped differently. The question becomes less about who is ahead and more about whether you are responding faithfully to what God is asking of you today. There is tremendous peace hidden inside that shift. Comparison begins losing its power. Jealousy slowly weakens. The desperate need to keep up with everyone else's timeline fades, because your attention becomes fixed on the quiet work God is accomplishing in your own heart. And something beautiful begins happening almost without your noticing. The loneliness that once felt purely empty gradually becomes sacred space. The silence that frightened you becomes the place where you hear God's gentle guidance more clearly than before. The hours you once spent worrying about who left begin turning into hours spent discovering who God is. Instead of constantly asking why certain doors closed, you begin thanking Him for remaining faithful even when you could not understand His timing. This transformation does not happen overnight. There are still days when memories ache. There are still moments when you wish someone truly understood everything you have been carrying. There are still occasions when you wonder whether the cost of growth has been too high. Yet every time those questions arise, you also remember how far God has already brought you. You remember the fears that once controlled you, but no longer do. You remember the habits He patiently changed. You remember the prayers He answered in ways you did not recognize at first. You remember the peace that quietly entered your life while you were looking for something entirely different. Slowly you begin realizing that God has not merely been removing people. He has been removing everything that prevented you from depending more fully on Him. And perhaps the greatest surprise of all is that as your roots grow deeper in His love, you become more capable of loving others without needing them to complete you. That is the kind of freedom the next part of this journey will continue to uncover, revealing why the people God eventually brings into your life often meet a version of you that could only exist because you first walked through the painful process of outgrowing almost everyone. There comes a moment when you stop asking God to bring your old life back and begin asking Him to teach you how to live faithfully in the life He is building now. It is not a dramatic moment that everyone around you notices. It happens quietly, almost invisibly. It happens during an ordinary morning when you realize you are no longer chasing the same things that once consumed your thoughts. It happens during prayer when your heart no longer asks only for relief, but also for wisdom. It happens when you discover that peace has started replacing panic, even though many of your circumstances remain unchanged. That is one of the clearest signs that God has been doing a deeper work than you first imagined. He has not simply been changing your surroundings, He has been changing you. Looking back, you begin to understand that every painful season carried lessons that comfort alone could never have taught. The friendships that slowly faded taught you not to anchor your identity in people's opinions. The unanswered messages taught you that silence does not always mean rejection. The closed doors taught you that disappointment and divine protection can sometimes look remarkably similar in the moment. The waiting taught you patience that no shortcut could have produced. The loneliness taught you that God's presence becomes most precious when every other source of reassurance feels uncertain. None of those lessons felt like gifts while you were living through them. In fact, there were days when you begged God to remove the very circumstances that later became part of your testimony. That is often how spiritual transformation works. We rarely recognize its beauty while it is unfolding, because growth usually feels like loss before it feels like blessing. The tree does not celebrate while its roots are pushing through hard ground. The athlete does not enjoy every painful repetition that strengthens hidden muscles. The person learning to trust God does not always feel joyful while surrendering the familiar. Yet afterward, when they look behind them, they discover that what once felt unbearable became one of the places where God proved Himself most faithful. Perhaps that is why you can now see things you once overlooked. You notice people carrying burdens behind their smiles. You become slower to judge because you know what hidden battles feel like. You become quicker to extend grace because you remember how patient God has been with you. The pain that could have made you harder has instead begun making you gentler. The rejection that could have made you bitter has begun teaching compassion. The loneliness that could have convinced you to isolate forever has instead created a deeper appreciation for genuine relationships rooted in honesty, faith, and mutual encouragement. This is the beautiful paradox of God's work. He often uses the very experiences that seem to reduce your life to quietly enlarge your heart. Suddenly, you understand that outgrowing almost everyone was never about becoming more important than anyone else. It was about becoming more available to the person God created you to be. If you had remained exactly the same, you might have stayed comfortable, but you also might have missed the transformation your soul had been longing for all along. Comfort preserves the familiar. God often chooses transformation instead. Transformation asks you to trust Him when you cannot yet see the destination. It asks you to keep walking when the path feels unfamiliar. It asks you to believe that His goodness has not changed simply because your life has. There may still be moments when loneliness returns unexpectedly. Certain memories may still make your heart ache. You may still watch other people surrounded by large circles of friends and wonder why your own journey has looked so different. When those thoughts come, remember that numbers have never been God's measure of faithfulness. Throughout Scripture, some of the deepest moments of spiritual formation happened in places where people stood with very little visible support. They learned that God's presence could sustain them when everything else seemed uncertain. That same truth remains available today. You are not forgotten because your circle became smaller. You are not abandoned because fewer people understand your heart. You are not failing because your path looks different from someone else's. God has never measured your worth by popularity. He has always looked at the condition of your heart. There is another truth that often becomes clear only after enough time has passed. The relationships God preserves through seasons of growth become incredibly precious because they are no longer built merely on shared history. They are built on shared purpose. They survive honesty. They welcome growth instead of resisting it. They celebrate obedience even when they do not fully understand every detail of your calling. These are the kinds of relationships that strengthen faith rather than compete with it. They remind you that while God may reduce certain crowds, He never leaves His children without the encouragement they truly need. Sometimes He replaces quantity with depth. Sometimes He replaces constant attention with genuine presence. Sometimes He removes noise so you can finally recognize the quiet voices He has been sending into your life all along. As you continue forward, Guard your heart carefully. Do not allow your past disappointments to convince you that every future relationship will end the same way. Pain has a way of whispering that history will endlessly repeat itself. Faith gently answers that God is capable of writing new chapters. Leave room for hope. Leave room for unexpected friendships. Leave room for conversations that restore your confidence in people. Leave room for the possibility that the Lord who faithfully carried you through seasons of isolation also knows exactly how to provide companionship at the right time and in the right way. At the same time, never forget the greatest gift this season has already given you. It has taught you that your deepest security cannot depend upon whether people stay or leave. It rests in the one whose love does not fluctuate with circumstances. Human affection can change. Seasons change, opportunities change, even your own understanding changes as you mature. But God's character remains constant. His faithfulness does not expire when your plans do. His compassion does not disappear because your prayers take longer than expected. His purpose is not cancelled because you experienced rejection. If anything, some of your deepest disappointments have quietly become places where His sustaining grace has become most visible. One day you may look back on this season with tears that are different from the tears you shed while living through it. They will not be tears of confusion, but of gratitude. You will remember nights when you believed everything was falling apart and realize that God was actually putting the pieces together in a way you could not yet understand. You will remember feeling left behind, only to discover that He had been protecting you from paths that would have delayed your growth. You will remember questioning your worth because others walked away, only to realize that your value had never been determined by who chose to stay. Most of all, you will recognize that God was never asking you to become someone impressive. He was inviting you to become someone faithful, faithful in private, faithful in waiting, faithful in disappointment, faithful when no one applauded your obedience, faithful when your prayers seemed to echo in silence, faithful when the only evidence of His work was the quiet change taking place inside your own heart. That is the kind of transformation that lasts, because it is rooted in Him rather than in circumstances. So if today you find yourself grieving relationships that no longer fit the person God is shaping you to become, do not assume your story is ending. You may simply be standing between chapters. The page you are on may feel quieter than the last one, but quiet pages often prepare the reader for the most meaningful turning point. Continue walking with humility. Continue choosing forgiveness over resentment. Continue seeking God even when His timing stretches your patience. Continue believing that no season surrendered to Him is ever wasted. The people you have outgrown are not proof that you have failed. They are reminders that God has continued His work in you even when it was costly. And if He has been faithful enough to carry you this far, then you can trust Him with every step that still lies ahead. The road may remain unfamiliar for a while longer, but you do not walk it alone. The God who began the good work within you has not stopped shaping your heart. He is still leading, still refining, still strengthening, still teaching, and still reminding you that your greatest growth has never been measured by how many people walked beside you, but by how faithfully you learned to walk with Him.